The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. 12 heavy tanks sat dead in the swamp, silent, blind, useless. Engineers tore them apart piece by piece under gunfire, but nothing worked. Command gave the final order: destroy everything, walk away. Then she arrived, grease on her hands, no rank worth noticing. No one listened when she said, "Give me 9 minutes." They laughed. She didn't argue. She just listened to the machine. 9 minutes later, the swamp shook. Engines roared back to life. And when the enemy advanced, they realized too late these machines were never dead. They were waiting for her. The salt marsh had no name on any map that mattered. It existed only as a grid reference: 2 letters, 4 numbers on the laminated overlays spread across the Command 10 central table. On paper, it was a transit corridor, a stretch of flat terrain wide enough for an armored column, stable enough to hold 30 tons of rolling steel. On paper, it made sense. In reality, the ground was a lie. 3 days of rain had turned the firm crust into something that looked like earth but moved like water. The tanks had pushed through on the first day with confidence, their treads churning through ankle-deep mud. Commanders hatched up and watching the gray horizon. By the time the lead elements had crossed 2 kilometers, the rear of the column was already sinking past the sponson plates. The order to halt came too late for the last 4 vehicles. They went and passed their road wheels. One of them tilted 17 degrees before the driver killed the engine. And then, something stranger happened. Not just those 4. All 12. The electronics went first, not blown out, not shorted, just gone. As if someone had reached into the guts of every machine simultaneously and removed something fundamental. The displays winked out. The intercom crackled twice and went silent. The thermal sights, which had been tracking movement on the far tree line, turned black. Sergeant First Class Owen Hartley was in the 3rd tank from the rear when it happened. He remembered the feeling precisely, because it was unlike anything he had experienced in 9 years of armored operations. Not an explosion, not a jolt, just a cessation, like a heart stopping mid-beat. 1 second, the engine was turning over at idle, a low, felt in the chest rumble that crews stopped consciously hearing after the first hour. The next second, silence so complete he could hear the rain on the turret armor. He tried the manual override. Nothing. He called to his driver over the internal comm. The speaker produced. He unlatched the commander's hatch and pushed up into the rain. Around him, 11 other hatches were opening. 11 other figures rising into the gray afternoon with the same slow, bewildered movements of men who had just been told the rules of physics had changed. Nobody shouted. That was the strangest part. In Owen's experience, catastrophe came with noise, men yelling over each other, orders cutting across counter-orders, the controlled chaos of a crew working a problem. This was different. This was quiet. They looked at each other across the tops of their dead machines. Below them, the marsh made soft sucking sounds against the hull plates. The first engineer team arrived within 4 hours. 3 vehicles, 7 men. Master Sergeant Dennis Calloway leading, a man with 22 years of field maintenance experience and a reputation for fixing things that weren't supposed to be fixable. He had the compact, self-contained manner of someone who had spent 2 decades solving other people's worst days. He walked the line of dead tanks without expression, making small notes on a waterproof pad. "All 12, he said. "All 12, Owen confirmed. Calloway turned and looked back at the nearest hull. His eyes went to the exhaust ports, the external fuel fittings, the antenna mounts. He was cataloging without speaking, filing impressions. "Same time?" he asked. "Within about 30 seconds. Start to finish." Calloway wrote something, capped his pen, and said nothing else for a moment. "Get me under the first one." They worked through the night. Calloway's team replaced the primary power distribution unit in Tank 3, the vehicle with the best access given the way it had settled in the mud. When that produced nothing, they pulled the secondary battery bus. They replaced the main circuit breaker assembly, a procedure that required 2 men lying on their backs in 6 inches of brackish water, working by headlamp, hands going numb within 20 minutes. They tested each replacement with a field voltmeter. Voltage present, circuit intact. Still nothing. On the second day, a second team arrived. Younger men, more recently trained, carrying diagnostic equipment that Calloway's unit didn't have: thermal imaging arrays, digital oscilloscopes, a laptop loaded with proprietary fault isolation software. They connected leads to the vehicle's data bus and ran sweeps. The software returned errors that made the younger technicians frown and look at each other. "It's not reading a fault," said Corporal Brett Simmons, who was 24 and had finished top of his class at the maintenance school 8 months prior. "That's the problem. The bus is active, current is flowing. Everything says the system is operational. But it won't start, said Calloway. But it won't start, Simmons agreed. He ran the sweep again. Same result. It's like asking someone if they're sick and having them say no, but they're lying on the floor, he said. Calloway looked at him without expression. That's not a useful observation, he said. Simmons looked back at the laptop. The thermal imaging showed nothing abnormal. The hull was cold and wet and returned exactly the temperature signature of 12 tons of waterlogged steel in a salt marsh in 3-day rain. No hot spots indicating a failed component. No cold zones suggesting a break in the heating system. The machine simply registered as inert. On the second night, Calloway sat outside Tank 3 on an ammunition crate someone had pulled from one of the support vehicles, and he drank coffee that had gone cold while he was drinking it, and he looked at the line of hulls in the rain. Owen found him there at 0200 and didn't say anything, just poured his own cup from the same thermos and sat on another crate. They stayed like that for 20 minutes. 2 men in wet gear in the dark, watching dead machines do nothing. It's not electrical, Calloway said finally. You said it's electrical, Owen said. I know what I said. Calloway turned the cup in his hands. Everything we've replaced is electrical. Every test we've run is electrical. The diagnostic says the bus is live. The voltmeter says current is present. Somewhere between the system being electrically complete and the system actually operating, something is missing. He paused. That's not a failure I can find with a voltmeter. Then what do you use? Calloway didn't answer that. They sat in the rain. In 2009, Calloway said eventually, I had a vehicle in the Kandahar province. Generator kept cutting out. Not failing cutting out. Running fine, then stopping, then starting again 40 minutes later. Ran diagnostics. Replaced the generator. Replaced the fuel pump. Replaced the voltage regulator. Replaced every component that the fault isolation guide identified. He drank the cold coffee. Turned out to be a pebble. Specific size, specific shape. It had worked its way into the generator cooling intake and was intermittently blocking airflow, but only at certain temperatures, only in certain ambient conditions. Thermal cutoff kept tripping. He paused. A pebble. 3 weeks. The manual didn't have a diagnostic pathway for pebbles. Owen considered this. You're telling me the answer might be something stupid, he said. I'm telling you the answer might be something small, Calloway said. There's a difference. He stood up, emptying his coffee cup into the mud. Small and stupid aren't the same thing. Small means you need to look with a different tool. Stupid means someone made an obvious mistake. Whatever this is, it's not obvious. He looked at the tank. It's hiding, and it's hiding well. He went back inside. Owen stayed on his crate and watched the rain make rings on the water between the reeds. He thought about Calloway's pebble, about the distance between a complete system and a functioning one, about the things that hid in the gap between those two states. By the third morning, the pressure changed in quality. It was no longer the pressure of a technical problem. It had become the pressure of a strategic one. The column had been meant to anchor the left flank of a larger push. Without them, the flank was open. Intelligence was reporting movement in the tree line 2 kilometers east, not massed, not committed, but probing, feeling for weakness. The kind of movement that preceded something larger. Colonel Richard Marsh arrived at 0700 on the third day. He was a tall man, and he stood in the rain without a hat, looking at the 12 dead hulls with an expression that contained no emotion whatsoever. That absence was its own statement. Owen had seen Marsh angry before. Angry was actually easier. This blankness was something different. Calloway briefed him for 4 minutes. When Calloway finished, Marsh was quiet for a long time. Options, he said finally. Sir, we've replaced every component we can access. The diagnostics show no fault. We've run out of the things we know how to check. So your professional assessment, Marsh said, is that you don't know. Yes, sir. Another silence. The rain tapped steadily on the colonel's shoulders. Then I need a decision, Marsh said. We cannot allow these assets to fall into enemy hands. If we can't move them, we destroy them. No one spoke. I'll give you until 1400, Marsh said. If they're not running by then, we blow them and walk. He turned and walked back toward the command vehicle without hurrying. His footsteps made clean, deliberate impressions in the mud. Owen watched him go. Then he looked at the tanks again, the 12 of them in a loose, staggered line, settling further into the earth with each hour, their armor beating with rain, their barrels pointed at nothing. They had cost more money than Owen could conceptualize. They represented months of production, years of design, the combined effort of thousands of people, and in 4 hours, They would be shaped charge casings worth of metal fragments scattered across a salt marsh. It felt like waste in a way that went beyond the practical. It felt like a small defeat that nobody would report. The shaped charges arrived at 1,100. 3 crates, handled carefully by 2 ordnance technicians who had clearly done this before. They worked without drama, setting the charges at the prescribed points: hull, front, engine compartment, ammunition storage. The positioning was practiced, almost elegant in its efficiency. Each placement took less than 2 minutes. Owen watched from 50 meters away. Around him, the maintenance teams were packing their equipment. Calloway supervised it with the same expressionless competence he brought to everything. Tools went into cases. Cases went onto vehicles. Simmons was folding up the diagnostic laptop with movements that were slightly more deliberate than necessary, as if pace could substitute for resolution. The order had come down at 0930. Marsh had not waited until 1400. Intel moved the timeline up, was the explanation Owen received. He did not ask for more detail. The math was simple: faster movement to the east, faster decision here. The machines that couldn't run were now obstacles rather than assets, and obstacles in a combat zone had exactly one fate. Owen walked to Tank 3. His tank. Technically he had commanded it for 11 months. He put his hand on the front slope. The steel was cold in the way that only wet metal in sustained rain manages to be cold, a penetrating cold that went past the skin. He stood like that for a moment. He was not a sentimental man. He was not thinking about the machine. He was thinking about the men who had built it, and the men who would have fought from it, and the entirely arbitrary nature of the decision that was about to reduce all of that to wreckage. He was thinking about how the failure had come from nowhere and gone nowhere. No answer, no lesson, just absence. He was also thinking about Calloway's coffee at 0200 and the pebble in Kandahar, and the distinction between small and stupid. Whatever this was, it was small. It had hidden from every instrument they carried, and every procedure in their manuals, and it was going to keep hiding because they were out of time and out of options. And in 40 minutes the ordnance technicians were going to ensure that nothing in these vehicles was hiding anywhere ever again. Owen had been in the army for 9 years. He had seen equipment lost before, vehicles destroyed in combat, vehicles lost to accident, vehicles simply worn past the point of usefulness and turned in for disposal. Loss was a practical reality of operating in the field, and he had made his peace with it the way professionals made their peace with the things they couldn't control. You adapted. You continued, but this felt different because it was preventable. Somewhere inside these 12 hulls was a fact, a physical, specific, identifiable fact that explained everything. It existed. It was real. It was waiting to be found. And because no one had found it, because the tools brought to find it were not quite the right tools for the specific shape of this particular hiding, 12 machines that could have run were going to be destroyed. That bothered him in a way that pure loss didn't. Behind him, Calloway said quietly, "We tried." "I know," Owen said. He took his hand off the hull. Prep for movement. He called to no one in particular. The logistics vehicle came from the north. It was a standard medium truck, nothing notable about it, threading its way along the track that ran parallel to the marsh edge. Owen noticed it only because it was moving slower than it should, not the careful pace of a driver navigating bad ground, but the pace of someone looking at something, looking at the tanks. It stopped. A figure climbed down from the passenger side, slight, moving with the unhurried economy of someone who was not performing for any audience. Coveralls that had started the week some shade of olive green but were now more accurately described as dark oil stain, with specific concentrations near the elbows and along the right forearm. Short brown hair, wet against her neck. She was looking at the nearest tank the way Calloway had looked at it on the first night, cataloging, filing, not needing to comment. Owen watched her approach. The way she moved was specific, not military precise in the surface sense, not squared shoulders and measured pace, but with the particular efficiency of someone who had spent years operating in environments where unnecessary movement had consequences. Her steps placed themselves with care. Her eyes were moving while her body stayed still, cataloging the vehicles, the terrain, the positions of the men watching her, in the quick peripheral way that people learned when they needed to build situational awareness without appearing to. Owen recognized it the way you recognize something you couldn't quite name. Like hearing a tune you'd known as a child and not being able to place it until 3 hours later. "You can't be here," he said. Standard. Not unfriendly, just procedural. She looked at him. Her eyes were pale, a gray-green that registered as almost colorless in the flat rain light. "I heard about this on the way through," she said. Her voice was level, not loud, the kind of voice that made you lean in slightly. All 12 lost at once. That's right. What did the diagnostics show? Owen paused. The question was precise. Not what happened or what's wrong, what did the diagnostics show? She knew enough to know there had been diagnostics. No fault detected, he said. She nodded once, slowly, as if this confirmed something. Who is this? Calloway had come up beside Owen without hurrying. Specialist. Owen read the tape on her coveralls. Specialist, Diane Marsh. He paused the surname. Any relation to— No, she said simply. There are a lot of Marshes. Specialist. This area is being prepped for demolition. You need to clear. 9 minutes, she said. Calloway looked at her. Excuse me? Give me 9 minutes with the nearest hull, she said. If nothing changes, I'll clear and you can proceed. There was a quality to the stillness that followed. Not silence, the rain continued. And somewhere behind them a vehicle engine was running, and the ordnance technicians were moving, but a stillness of attention, of the moment before a decision. Calloway looked at Owen. Owen looked at Diane. She was not performing confidence. She wasn't performing anything. She was simply standing in the rain with the patient self-containment of someone who had been waiting in uncomfortable positions for long enough that waiting had become neutral. Sergeant First Class Harold Briggs, who had been with the maintenance team for 3 days and heard everything and fixed nothing, said from 6 feet away, "She's from logistics. She's going to fix what we couldn't?" Nobody responded to that. Calloway looked at his watch. He looked at the tank. He looked at Diane. 9 minutes, he said. Not 10, 9, she agreed. She didn't go to the access panels. That was the first thing Owen noticed. The engineer's instinct, his own instinct upon approaching a vehicle with electrical failure, was to open it up, get inside, start at the known components, and work outward. There was a logic to it. The logic of systems. Find the system, identify the subsystem, isolate the component. It was how the training ran. It was how the documentation was written. She went to the hull side and put both hands flat against the armor. Not the palm, exactly, more the fingertips and the upper palm, the part of the hand with the most nerve density. She closed her eyes for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she moved her hands 6 inches to the left, then down, then to the right, toward the front slope. Briggs made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Calloway shot him a look. The sound stopped. Owen watched. Her movements were too deliberate to be random. She was covering the hull surface in a pattern, not a search. Exactly. More like listening. He had seen men do something similar with pipes, feeling for vibration, for the specific resonance that indicated flow or blockage. Plumbers, sometimes. Old ones, the kind who had developed a haptic sense that their instruments couldn't replicate. But the vehicle was dead. There was nothing to feel. Except he reconsidered that was the assumption everyone had been working from. Dead meant silent. Dead meant still. But something had happened to these vehicles. Something had put them in this state. And whatever had done that was still in there. Still present. Still a physical fact inside the hull. The question wasn't only what had failed. The question was what the failure had left behind. He watched her move to the forward section of the hull. Her right hand pressed flat, held still, moved 3 inches, held still again. She was mapping something, not the vehicle's systems, which existed on paper in every technical manual they had with them, but the vehicle's actual surface, its real topography of oxidation, and wear and accumulated exposure. There was a difference between the vehicle as designed and the vehicle as it existed after 3 days in a salt marsh, and she was reading the second one. Owen thought about what it would take to develop that kind of reading. Not the knowledge. Knowledge was in manuals, accessible to anyone. The feel of it, the calibration, the knowing what normal felt like, so that the not normal registered as something other than noise, that took time. That took a specific kind of time, the kind spent in conditions where the small wrong thing had large consequences. After 3 minutes of this, 3 full minutes of Diane moving her hands across the exterior of the hull in the rain, eyes sometimes closed, sometimes tracking the surface in a way that suggested she was reading something too subtle for vision, she stopped. She stood still for 4 seconds. Then she went to the front of the vehicle, crouched, and looked at the gap between the lower hull plate and the ground. The gap was 14 inches. In optimal conditions, a paved surface, a level hardstand, the clearance would have been closer to 18. The marsh had taken 4 inches of ground clearance away. and the continued settling of the hull had compressed the gap further at the forward end. It was not a space that invited entry. Diane lowered herself to the ground without comment. Owen watched her go flat, not the careful, self-conscious maneuvering of someone encountering an obstacle, but the fluid, practiced movement of someone for whom horizontal was simply another position. She was in the gap before anyone had fully processed her intention. Briggs said, "She's not going to." "Quiet," said Calloway, flashlight from her coverall pocket. The beam moved in the gap. From where Owen stood, he could see the edge of the light against the underside of the hull, casting long shadows from the suspension components. He could hear barely, under the rain, the soft sound of her moving through the mud. He thought about the gap, about what it meant that she had gone there rather than to the engine bay, or the driver's station, or the electronics compartment. The underside of the hull was not where the primary electrical systems lived. The wiring harnesses ran there, yes, but they were bundled and sealed, designed to withstand exactly the kind of environmental exposure this vehicle had been subjected to, designed to withstand it, designed by people who had tested their specifications against simulated conditions. He thought about the salt marsh, about how 3 days of rain in a coastal environment created a specific atmospheric chemistry, the spray from the marsh surface, carried in the low fog that had barely lifted in 3 days, settling on every exposed surface in fine crystite accumulation. He thought about the word, simulated. The light in the gap moved steadily. She was not rushing. She moved from section to section with the thoroughness of someone who was not looking at the most obvious place but for the most likely hiding place. There was a difference. The obvious place was where the manuals said the systems lived. The most likely hiding place was wherever the environment would find the smallest point of ingress, the tiniest discontinuity in the engineered defense, the one interface between the protected and the exposed. 4 minutes. 5. Owen's watch counted. Calloway stood absolutely still, watching the gap. Even Briggs had gone quiet. She found it in minute 7. She didn't announce it. There was no exclamation, no sudden movement of the flashlight, no calling up to the men standing in the rain. There was only a brief cessation of movement 3, perhaps 4 seconds of complete stillness under the hull, and then the deliberate, careful repositioning of her upper body that Owen recognized as someone making room to work in a confined space. He crouched down. In the flashlight's beam, partially obscured by a suspension bracket, there was a wiring harness junction, one of perhaps 40 along the underside of the vehicle. Standard construction, the outer sheath was intact. The junction housing was closed. To every visible inspection, it was fine. But where the junction met the bracket mount, at the point where the harness made a slight bend to accommodate the routing, there was a single wire, thinner than the others, running outside the sheath. An anomaly in the bundling, not a fault exactly. A deviation from the routing specification that had been within tolerance when the vehicle was built, and had remained within tolerance through every maintenance cycle, and had remained within tolerance through the first day of operation in this environment. The wire's insulation was copper-colored, not the color it was supposed to be. The color of exposed metal, where the outer jacket had experienced galvanic corrosion from sustained salt-moisture contact. The copper of the conductor itself, visible through the jacket, had oxidized to a mottled green-brown, the specific shade of copper that had been in sustained contact with saline solution. The corrosion had not severed the wire. It had done something subtler. It had increased the resistance at the junction to a value that the vehicle's diagnostic system designed to detect open circuits and short circuits could not flag. The current was still flowing. The voltage was still present. The diagnostic said, all systems operational. But the resistance had climbed high enough that the signal the wire was carrying, a grounding reference for the entire vehicle's power management system, had degraded past the threshold the system needed to function. Not absent. Not wrong by diagnostic standards. Just slightly, quietly, fatally diminished. And that reference signal ran through the same junction in all 12 vehicles, because they were the same model, built to the same specification, deployed at the same time, in the same environment. One wire. One failure mode. 12 dead tanks. Diane looked at the wire for a moment. Then she reached for her toolkit. She had brought electrical tape, standard issue insulating tape, the black kind, the kind found in every maintenance kit in every vehicle in every logistics convoy. Not a repair tool. Not a solution that anyone in the maintenance teams would have considered, because the maintenance teams were looking for the failed component, the broken system, the thing that needed to be replaced. She cleaned the oxidized section first, a small wire brush from her kit. 3 strokes, the action of someone who had done this before in spaces with no room for error. She dried it with a cloth. She examined the conductor. Then she applied the tape. Not sloppily, with precision. overlapping each layer, sealing the junction where the harness made its bend, isolating the wire from the bracket where the galvanic contact had occurred. 20 seconds of work. The movements were economical to the point of appearing slow. Though they weren't slow, they were simply stripped of anything unnecessary. She lay still for a moment after. Then she said, without raising her voice, to Owen, who was crouched at the edge of the gap, "Try the master power." Owen straightened. He climbed up the hull and dropped into the commander's position. The interior smelled of mud and metal and the specific chemical sharpness of electronics that hadn't run in 3 days. He found the master power switch by feel. He pressed it. For 1 second, one long second that contained the weight of 72 hours and 12 machines and an entire strategic operation, nothing happened. Then the instrument panel lit up. It came on in sequence, the way it always did: the power bus indicator first, then the system's status board, then the thermal sight cycling through its startup protocol, the screen going from black to static to the cold, clear resolution of the thermal image. Outside the frontal arc, he could see the gray shapes of the other 11 hulls. The engine indicator showed ready. He pressed the starter. The engine caught on the first compression. The sound was enormous. After 3 days of rain and silence and the muted, defeated sounds of a problem without a solution, the engine of a 70-ton vehicle coming back to life was physically large, felt in the chest wall and the back of the jaw. Owen sat in the rumbling commander's seat and did not move for a moment. He had expected to feel triumph. What he felt instead was something quieter, a kind of release, the uncoiling of a tension he had been holding so consistently for 3 days that he had stopped registering it as tension, and had come to think of it simply as the weight of the present. It released all at once, in the first second of the engine running, and left him feeling oddly light. Through the open hatch above him, he could hear the rain, and under it, the sound of the engine steady, unhurried, exactly as it should be. He keyed the radio. "Command, this is 3-6. I have a running vehicle." He paused. "Stand by for more." Below him, Diane had emerged from under the hull. She was standing in the rain, looking at the other 11 vehicles. She pulled a length of electrical tape from the roll in her hand and moved to the next vehicle in line. She did not look at the men watching her. She crouched and went under the second hull without ceremony. Owen climbed down and followed her. He reached in and found the junction in the second vehicle in 40 seconds. Now that he knew what to look for, knew the exact point in the routing, the specific bracket, the specific anomaly, he did the repair with his own hands while she moved to the third vehicle. Calloway was at the fourth vehicle before Owen had finished with the second. Simmons, who had been standing with the look of someone being taught a lesson he had not enrolled for, went to the fifth. Even Briggs went, wordlessly, to the sixth. They worked down the line. The sound of engines starting, one by one, built from a single note into something that could be heard at a distance, a low, complex, overlapping rumble that resonated in the chest and moved through the marsh air with authority. By the time the 12th engine started, the ordnance technicians had already begun removing their shaped charges. The enemy scouts reached the tree line at 1,347. They had been moving since early morning. A careful, probing advance through the eastern woods, designed to confirm what their intelligence had been telling them for 12 hours, that the armored column was dead in the marsh, that its demolition was imminent, that the left flank of the opposing position would be open by mid-afternoon. The scouts were professionals. They had moved well and seen nothing to contradict the picture. 2 of them had been in observation positions since before dawn, watching through long-range optics, documenting the activity around the stalled vehicles. They had seen the engineers. They had seen the diagnostic equipment. They had seen the growing stillness that preceded an abandonment decision. They had filed their reports with confidence. The column is non-operational. The column is preparing for demolition. The column will be gone. What they saw at the marsh edge, when the first of them pushed through the tree line, was this: 12 main battle tanks, engines running, arrayed in a line formation with overlapping fields of fire, thermal sights active, commanders in the hatches, every vehicle oriented toward the eastern approach. The scout who saw them first had been in the field for 7 years. He had seen many things. He understood, immediately and completely, what he was looking at: not just the tanks themselves, but the precision of their arrangement. The way each vehicle's sector of fire interlocked with the next, the absence of the hurried improvisation that characterized a recently recovered unit scrambling to get organized. They looked like they had been waiting. They looked like a force that had been ready for hours. He remained perfectly still for 10 seconds, processing this, before he reached for his radio. The scout's report, when it reached the forward headquarters 12 minutes later, contained language that was professionally neutral, but conveyed something beyond professional neutrality. The advance halted. The probing forces, which had been moving with the confidence of people walking through an unlocked door, stopped moving. The communications that followed were, by any standard, urgent. The tactical picture that had made the advance look like an opportunity now looked like something else, entirely like bait, perhaps, or like a demonstration of patience that had been running for 3 days. Colonel Marsh, in his command vehicle, received the update with the same expressionless manner with which he absorbed all information. He read the report twice. Then he looked at Owen's radio traffic from 16 minutes earlier, the word "stand by for more," and something moved very briefly behind his eyes. "Get me the status on all 12, he said. "All 12 running, sir. Full systems. They're requesting permission to advance." Marsh was quiet for a moment. "Tell them to hold," he said. "Hold and be seen." He understood, in the particular way that experienced commanders understood things, that sometimes the most powerful move was not to advance, but to simply exist, to allow the enemy to comprehend the distance between what they had believed was true and what was actually true. The 12 vehicles sitting in the marsh, engines running, thermal sights active, visible to anyone watching from the tree line, were not a combat action. They were a statement. The statement was, "You were wrong about us." The forward probe pulled back by 1500. By 1600, the intelligence was showing withdrawal from the staging area. Whatever operation had been planned for the window of supposed vulnerability had been quietly cancelled, the way plans are cancelled when the foundation of the plan turns out not to exist. Owen, standing in his commander's hatch in the rain, watched the tree line. It was empty. He let out a breath that he had been holding, in some sense, for 3 days. The logistics vehicle was pulling out when Owen caught up to it. He reached the cab as Diane was climbing back into the passenger side. She had wiped her hands on a cloth that had made them marginally cleaner. The electrical tape roll was back in her kit. She was moving with the same unhurried economy she'd arrived with, no performance of satisfaction, no display. "Specialist," Owen said. She stopped, one hand on the doorframe, and looked at him. He didn't know exactly what he wanted to say. He had been thinking about it for the 40 minutes since the last engine had started, and he still didn't have a precise formulation. "Thank you" felt insufficient. "How did you know" felt like the wrong question. "The salt content," he said finally. "That's what you were feeling for. When you had your hands on the hull?" She considered this. "The vibration pattern," she said. "Or the absence of it. A hull that's been sitting in salt fog for 3 days has a specific surface oxidation. You can feel it through the paint if you know what you're comparing it to. I was looking for the area with the highest concentration." She paused. "That would be where the exposure was worst, where something small would have failed first." "You've worked on this model before?" "No." Owen waited. "But I've worked on older models," she said. "Ones built before the revised routing specifications. The junction placement is different on those. It's internal, fully sealed. I knew they'd changed the routing in this series. When you told me the diagnostics showed no fault, that was the pattern. The diagnostic is correct technically. The circuit is complete. The signal is just too weak to run the system." She glanced at the tank nearest to them. "It's not a failure, it's a degradation." Those read differently. "And the gap under the hull," Owen said. "You knew it would be there. The junction is mounted on the belly plate in this variant. It's in the technical manual. What's not in the technical manual is that the bracket mounting creates a micro gap in the harness routing under sustained vibration, and that gap is exactly where salt fog accumulates if you're operating in a coastal marsh." Owen looked at her. "That's not in any manual I've seen." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He thought about how to ask the next thing. "Before logistics," he said carefully. Her expression didn't change, exactly, but something in it acknowledged the question. 3 years in a different unit," she said. "Long deployments. I learned to pay attention to small things in bad conditions." She was looking past him now, toward the marsh, toward the distant gray tree line. "When you're in a fixed position for days at a time, in weather like this, you spend a lot of time learning to distinguish between things that matter and things that don't. A sound that's slightly wrong, a texture that's slightly different, a vibration that should be there but isn't." She paused. "You have to learn to be very still and very patient. Otherwise you miss it." Owen thought about what kind of unit deployed to fixed positions for days at a time, in the kind of terrain that required learning to be very still. He thought about her hands on the hull, the deliberate coverage of the surface, the closed eyes, the 4-second stillness before she moved to the front of the vehicle. The way she had gone under the hull with complete physical ease, no hesitation about the space. The way she had worked in the gap without a light for the first part of it. People who spent time in confined spaces in the dark, learning not to move, learning to wait. "You requested the transfer," he said. "Yes." "To logistics?" "Yes." She looked at him directly. "I'm good at this too." He nodded. In the back of the truck, he could see equipment cases, spare parts, the organized clutter of a logistics role. She had been doing it whatever it required. Maintaining vehicles, managing supply chains, solving the small and large problems of keeping equipment functional in the field. Doing it well, presumably, doing it without the unit patch of her previous assignment. "The credit," he said, "for the repair. I'll make sure it goes through." "Don't," she said, quiet but definite. "Sergeant Calloway's team was on site for 3 days," she said. "They identified every component they could reach and tested everything within their parameters. They did their job. The fault was in a place and pattern that wasn't within their parameters." She looked at him. "Put it in the report however you need to, but I don't need it." Owen stood in the rain for a moment. "Why?" he said. Not skeptically, genuinely. She thought about this. "Because in 3 years," she said slowly, "I learned that the thing you actually want isn't recognition for being right. It's to find the problem before it finds you." She glanced once more at the 12 running vehicles, and something in her expression, not quite a smile, too small for that, acknowledged their presence. Today that worked out. She climbed into the cab. The truck pulled out, back the way it had come, along the track that ran parallel to the marsh. Owen watched it until it rounded the bend and was gone. He walked back to Tank 3. He climbed up the hull and stood on the front slope, looking east. The tree line was still empty. The rain had eased slightly, not stopped, but downgraded from the sustained heavy fall of 3 days to something more intermittent. Through a gap in the overcast, a stripe of late afternoon light reached the marsh surface and turned the water between the reeds a flat, cold silver. Behind him, 11 engines idled. Calloway came to stand beside him. They stood without speaking for a while. "She hear the machine?" Calloway said finally. "Something like that," Owen said. Calloway thought about this. "I've been doing this 22 years, he said. "I've never seen anything like that." "Neither have I." Another pause. "She wasn't wrong, you know," Calloway said, "about the report. My team did the work. We replaced every component that should have been the problem. The reason she found it is that she knew to look somewhere we weren't trained to look." He paused. "That's not our failure. That's the gap in the specification." "I know," Owen said, "but she found it." "Yes." A pause. "What kind of unit, you think?" Calloway said. Owen looked at the tree line. "The kind that teaches you to be very still," he said. Calloway nodded. He looked at the stripe of silver light on the marsh. "Machines," he said quietly, "are funny things. They always tell you what's wrong with them. They just don't always use a language everyone speaks." Owen thought about hands on cold steel, about closed eyes, about the particular patience required to listen for something so small that every instrument in the inventory had missed it. He thought about 3 years of learning to be still. "No," he said, "not everyone." He stayed on the hull for a while longer, alone with the engines and the rain. The light on the marsh had faded as the cloud cover thickened again, and the silver stripe was gone, replaced by the flat gray of last light. In an hour it would be dark. The ordnance technicians had finished removing their charges and had departed quietly, without ceremony, their job having become unmade in the same time it had taken to make it. Simmons had walked past Owen once without speaking, but had nodded a small, precise acknowledgement that carried more weight than a longer gesture. The 12 tanks would move when orders came. They would take up positions. They would do the work they had been designed and built to do. The strategic picture that had deteriorated over 3 days had been repaired in 9 minutes, and no one who received the next morning's briefing would know the particulars of how or who, because the report would describe the maintenance team's successful isolation of a wiring fault, which was accurate in its essential facts if not in its precise attribution. Owen thought that was probably the right way to report it. The engines idled, the rain fell, the tree line stayed empty. Somewhere north of the marsh, a logistics truck moved at standard speed along a supply route. In the passenger seat, a specialist with grease-stained coveralls and pale gray-green eyes watched the road ahead. She was not thinking about the tanks. She had already moved to the next thing, because the next thing always existed, and the tanks were running now. and the problem was solved. She had learned that in the other unit that you did not carry the mission after the mission was over. You logged it, you filed it, you let it become the past, which was the only place it belonged. The instructors in her first year had been explicit about this, not because it was a comfortable idea but because it was a functional one. Attachment to outcomes was a liability. The sniper who spent the night after a shot running mental replays was a sniper who arrived the next morning with compromised attention. The past was for after the war, during the war. The past was a weight you put down. She had put it down. She had been putting it down, piece by piece, for 3 years, until putting things down had become its own kind of habit, the equal and opposite discipline to picking them up with full attention in the first place. What the instructors hadn't told her, because perhaps they hadn't known, was what happened when you transferred those habits out of the context they'd been developed for, when you took the stillness and the patience and the haptic reading of small signals and applied them not to a hillside in adverse conditions, but to the underside of a logistics vehicle in a maintenance bay. It turned out they translated. It turned out that machines and terrain had more in common than the training manuals acknowledged, both of them complex systems, both of them communicating constantly in a frequency below the threshold of ordinary attention, both of them yielding information only to people willing to be quiet enough to receive it. She hadn't known she would be good at maintenance. She had chosen logistics because logistics needed people who could solve problems in difficult conditions with limited resources, and she was demonstrably that. The vehicle work had come afterward, organically, the way skills tended to come when you applied genuine attention to a new domain. She had found she liked it. There was something clarifying about machines. They didn't have intentions. They didn't conceal things out of strategy or self-interest. They simply operated according to physical law, and failed according to the same. A machine that was failing was a machine communicating a specific truth about its own condition. The truth was always findable. It required patience and the willingness to look past the obvious and the documented toward the thing that existed in the space between specification and reality, which, she reflected, was not so different from anything else. She had learned patience in one direction. She was learning it in another. But there was one thing she carried, a habit, really, old training, hard to shake. Whenever she was in a vehicle, any vehicle, truck or tank or the battered logistics carrier she spent most of her days in now, she would press her fingers against some surface, the door frame, usually, or the dashboard edge, not consciously, just contact, just the faint, constant reading of the machine's state, engine rhythm, harmonic resonance in the chassis, the specific frequency of tires on wet gravel versus tires on asphalt versus tires on the compressed mud of a track that got too much rain. Each surface told her something. Most of what it told her was fine within normal parameters, nothing to flag, continue moving. But occasionally there was something slightly off, a frequency, a fraction of a hertz outside the expected range, a vibration that climbed when it should have stabilized. A sound that belonged to the next 1,000 miles of gradual wear rather than the current operational period. She would note it. She would check it at the next stop. She had caught 4 significant failures in the past year this way. 2 that would have left vehicles stranded. 1 that would have caused a brake failure. 1 that she still wasn't entirely sure about, but that she had flagged anyway because the data was ambiguous, and ambiguous data was worth a second look. Nobody asked her how she found these things. She didn't volunteer the explanation. Everything talks, she had been told, in the first month of her first unit, by a woman who had spent 12 years learning to listen to things that didn't use words. The trick is to be quiet enough to hear it. She kept her fingers on the door frame. The truck moved north through the thinning rain. The marsh receded behind her, and she listened, as she always did, to everything.